morning, I'm going to be welcoming you to panel 8, PRC Domestic Law, the Xinjiang Camps and the Transnational Advocacy. We have a fantastic panel speaking to us this morning. I'm going to introduce each panel member now, and then we'll go to each of them in order. We have Eva PILS. She is a professor of law at the Dixon Poon School of Law at King's College, and her presentation will be entitled Legal Political Transnational Advocacy Against China's Crimes in Xinjiang. We have Donald CLARKE from George Washington Law School, and he will also be joining us virtually to discuss legal aspects of Xinjiang detentions, points of argument regarding Chinese domestic law. That will be followed by TENG Biao, forgive me if I've mispronounced your name, from the University of Notre Dame. And he will also be joining us virtually to discuss the concentration camps and genocide in the Chinese political and legal context. And then we're doing something a little bit extraordinary. We have a presentation by an individual who will continue to remain anonymous, and our own Professor Jo will be representing the testimony, and she will be presenting the YouTube channel Nothing Happened on behalf of our anonymous guest. And our professor will be talking about the shouts of a handful of the younger generation, discordant notes in the CCP's grand narrative. So it's quite a heavy round, but panelists will be no doubt educating us on so many aspects of what we're trying to discuss and hopefully try and resolve. I'm going to turn to Eva first. You have around 10 minutes, and if you can stick to the time, that would be great. It means that we have more time to have a discussion afterwards. So we are now going live to Eva PILS.
Thanks for the introduction. So at this conference, we have already learned so much about the atrocities being committed in Xinjiang, about the evidence being compiled, about various assessments from legal, political, and other angles. And what sticks out for me among these analyses is that we cannot really understand the full extent of the crimes and systematic rights violations being perpetrated without considering the context of the legal political system in which they happen, and about which, of course, we are going to hear more in detail from other panelists here. It is a party state whose authorities are better able than most, at least considered in contemporary terms, to suppress information, to manipulate narratives, to censor and persecute human rights advocates. And of course, it is for that broader systemic reason that even as we recognize that many of the practices we are considering here are illegal and in part indeed, I believe, criminal under domestic Chinese law, we are not really able to consider in the context of this brilliant conference effective domestic legal advocacy or other advocacy on behalf of the persecuted Uyghur and other communities. Instead, we are very much looking in from the outside. We have to think about transnational advocacy efforts that might perhaps help address the situation. And I think perhaps it makes sense at this point to take a few minutes to ask ourselves what that means for organized advocacy, transnational advocacy, that is now being supplied by NGOs, but of course also non-Chinese governments, parliaments, international organizations, and so on. And so let me make a very few points. The first point, I think, is that as a scholar who has been studying human rights advocacy in and on China for many years, I think it is very obvious that we have observed a change in the orientation of human rights advocacy addressing China until a few years ago under a model that colleagues have described as graduated repression of civil society and advocacy in China. Many human rights groups try to basically engage topics and causes that are tolerated by the Chinese party state, and to do that so far as possible with partners in China. That, I think, could be very productive, but it could also lead to neglecting certain urgent human rights causes because they were considered as too sensitive. And to some extent, that setup reflected tensions amongst rights advocates also within China. With the shrinking, not to say the disappearance of spaces for civil society advocacy in China, these transnational groups were driven out or at least muted in their efforts, although, of course, some groups such as Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, and a number of dedicated groups focusing on human rights and continued their challenging work. At the same time, other groups, including some participating in this conference, have emerged to confront China on issues where there is no toleration for advocacy within China, and that certainly includes the very important issue of the international crimes being committed. So I think that as a second change that I would observe, I think that this necessary, you could say, almost paradigmatic shift away from engagement to confrontation has, I think, in some ways allowed certain very long-term problems to be addressed more clearly. So if we again think about the wider human rights issues raised within the context of the PRC, an example for that would be, I think that we now see generally more realistic appraisals of the chances of improvement of, say, the abusive and hazardous Chinese criminal justice system through reforms from within under the Chinese Communist Party leadership within essentially a state characterized by a unity, not separation of powers. To give another example, I think that as we grapple to understand the awful situation in Xinjiang, we're also much more sensitized to the problems of transnational human rights violations, including transnational censorship and disinformation emanating from the Chinese party state, and of course, and to some extent being transmitted by organizations here. Just on the previous panel this morning, for instance, we heard from James Murray about the role that, unfortunately, unhappily, universities can play in this context, and certainly some participants at this conference, including its wonderful organizer, main organizer, are very prominent examples for that. I think that, therefore, in some ways, the shift to confrontational human rights advocacy has had benefits. But I would also want to mention a few ways in which I think shifting to a more confrontational stance, especially on the issues that we are talking about here, issues of intense moral urgency involving many traumatic experiences. I think that this shift also brings risks. So first, I think that in some ways the complexity of domestic civil society kind of shifts out of focus. It drops out of the picture that civil society across China is repressed and silenced and paralyzed. And of course, it is therefore all the more important to remind ourselves that Chinese society, however suppressed, remains diverse. And it is important also in the context of atrocities in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region to think about diaspora advocacy, possibly across ethnic divides, and to think about the very hard to access and yet very important domestic discourses addressing these issues. And I think the conference is really to be complimented on including those perspectives. And also, second, I think that if we consider the, by now, of course, huge amount and intensity of democratic discourse addressing the systematic human rights violations in Xinjiang, but also addressing wider China issues, I think that one must observe that, of course, a lot of democratic discourse, political discourse, relies on very clear distinctions and positioning, and in that sense, on a partly confrontational logic of sort of, are you with me or against me? We see that play out in some of the discussions and debates about how to assess the situation in Xinjiang, for example, in the context of debates about the genocide question, the question of whether the situation should be recognized as currently occurring genocide. And I think that there is a certain risk of loss of nuance and expertise that are necessary for these to answer these questions. Again, I think the conference has been really brilliant in bringing different experts to get together and injecting that nuance and expertise. And relatedly, and this is my last point, I think that especially in the context of the more populist variants of political discourse on our relationship with China, I think that there is also a risk of targeting the very international and multilateralist institutions that ultimately I would say we need to rely on to address some of the issues we have been discussing, in particular also that of crimes against humanity and potential genocide. And I think that however frustrated we are with these institutions, I think that we need to uphold at least the idea of justice working at a global level, of international rule of law, even if we are critical about the detail of the way in which our current institutions operate. If we want to get anything like justice or a shadow of justice for Uyghurs and other persecuted communities in China. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva, for laying that out. We're now going to go over to the United States to hear from Donald Clarke, and he will be speaking to legal aspects of Xinjiang detentions, points of argument regarding Chinese domestic law. Donald, you have 10 minutes. The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Somebody indicate they hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, thanks. All right, so today I'm going to talk about the status of China's Xinjiang policies under Chinese law. So as it turns out, virtually everything that we read about is being done in violation of China's own law. And one might ask, why does it matter? So I'll address that question at the end. So first I want to talk about the detention camps that are known as re-education centers. So as we know, it now seems that there are, or at some point in the past, were more than 1 million people, virtually all Uyghur Muslims, of course, being held in these detention camps in Xinjiang and apparently in other provinces now as well. So what makes these detentions arbitrary and unlawful under Chinese law? So the somewhat surprising fact is that there's no publicly available law, regulation, or indeed any measure by any name that governs substance or process. Nobody could give you an authoritative list of the acts that will get you into the detention camp. There are such lists, but they are internal police guidelines, not public laws. Nobody can tell you who has the authority to make the decision and according to what procedures. And no one could tell you how, even in theory, let alone in practice, which is quite unimaginable, you might lodge some kind of protest or appeal against the detention decision. Now this, of course, in one sense, is not shocking news for anyone who follows what's going on in Xinjiang. Of course, it's totally arbitrary, you'll say. But I think we need to explicitly recognize how extraordinary it is and not normalize it. So here we are in 2021, talking about a great power that's a permanent member of the UN Security Council and a major player in the world economy that is engaging in this massive project of utter lawlessness, not just in the pejorative sense of lawlessness, but in a literal, technical sense, lawless under its own law. Now, is this really possible? Have I maybe overlooked something in my research? I don't think so. I've been, tooting this horn for about 3 years now, and so far nobody has been able to point out anything that would contradict what I just said. And let me give you a very specific example. In late 2018, a delegation of U.S. lawyers and legal academics went to China as part of an annual, what they call Track 2 Rule of Law Dialogue. And they specifically informed the Chinese participants well in advance, no surprises, no Perry Mason, surprise, that they would be asking about the legal basis for these detentions. And despite having, I'm sorry, is someone saying something? Okay. Despite having weeks to prepare a response, the Chinese participants had none. They simply could not come up with a legal basis, even a flimsy one, that wouldn't hold water even under Chinese law. All they could say was, well, we need to do this to fight terrorism. So that's a pretty astonishing situation. Now, if there were a legal basis, what would it look like? All right, well, under Article 37 of China's Constitution and also under its law on legislation, which is a national law, if you want to physically restrict personal liberty, that's permitted only if there's a statute passed at the central level by the National People's Congress or its standing committee. This is a fundamental element of Chinese legal system, and everybody understands this. Now, the overwhelming evidence says that detention in these re-education camps are not being carried out pursuant to any such statute. No pretense that any of the possibly relevant substantive procedural laws or the criminal law, criminal procedure law, security administration punishment law are being applied. So people are being put in these camps for offenses such as traveling abroad or having a long beard. Now, in the fall of 2018, there were a number of reports that China had legalized this system of detention camps. Not so. What happened was that the Xinjiang regional authorities, or provincial authorities, if you want to call them that, revised some legislation. And in doing so, they explicitly authorized something called education and training centers. But this does not legalize the detentions under Chinese law for a number of reasons. First of all, the legislation was passed by the Standing Committee of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Regions Legislature. That's not the National People's Congress. It has no authority to prescribe measures for detention. Secondly, even if it did have such authority, the legislation doesn't create the legal basis for the detentions. It just talks about creating education and training centers, doesn't say anything about them being places of mandatory detention, doesn't prescribe any procedures for identifying who should be sent there. So it cannot possibly be maintained that a local regulation, simply because it mentions the term education and training center, has thereby legalized anything that might go on in that facility. And then finally, even if this legislation made these detentions lawful in Xinjiang, it would not make them lawful anywhere else. And it seems that detainees are now being shipped off in large numbers to other provinces. So the conclusion is that despite its complete control of China's legislative system and courts, the party has chosen to carry out this detention campaign completely outside of China's own legal system. Now, Chinese officials have recently begun making the argument that the re-education camps are a lenient alternative to imprisonment under China's criminal law. That won't wash for at least two reasons. First of all, it's premised on the false assumption that those in the camp have committed offenses that would justify imprisonment under the criminal law. And second, if re-education camps really were a voluntary alternative to imprisonment, then we wouldn't see all the measures that are there to prevent escapes from the re-education camp. Okay, so much for the camps. Now, in addition to those detentions, which occur without even the pretense of a legal basis, there are also a large number of detentions that have occurred under the pretense of law, using China's criminal law and criminal procedure law, and placing people in actual prison. And in fact, there is some evidence to suggest that the use of re-education camps is winding down with the use of facilities for people accused or convicted of crimes, that is to say, pretrial detention facilities, prisons going up. And there is some evidence to suggest that the same people are being held, but simply under a different name. So in April of this year, the AP was granted access to a pretrial detention center called Dabachang. And despite the officials' insistence there that it was completely unrelated to the re-education camps, there's overwhelming evidence that the location used to be a camp and that the authorities just changed the sign in the front in 2019 with the same prisoners kept inside. So what do we know about this trip? Well, the publicly available statistics show two things. First of all, something big is happening. And second, it's not happening through regular trials in courts according to regular procedures. If we look at China's own published statistics, there are clearly way too many criminal cases to be handled properly by the courts. So according to annual reports of the Xinjiang People's Procuratorate, which is in charge of prosecutions, for example, in 2016, there were about 27,000 criminal arrests and 41,000 criminal indictments. That's 2016. In 2017, that goes up to 228,000 arrests, more than 10 times the 2016 number, and 216,000 criminal indictments. Now, how did the Xinjiang courts handle these cases? Official sources tell us that in 2016, there were about 5,900 judges handling 400,000 cases of all kinds, not per year, not just criminal. That's 68 cases per judge. 68, remember that number. 2 years later, in 2018, official sources say there were 3,800 judges, fewer than 2 years earlier, in line with ongoing judicial reforms, handling 500,000 cases of all kinds per year. That's 132 cases per judge, almost double. So these are the numbers for cases of all kinds. In terms of criminal cases, we went from 7 criminal cases per judge to 57 criminal cases per judge. So we now have fewer judges handling 216,000 criminal indictments than were apparently needed to handle 41,000 criminal indictments a couple of years before. So there are a number of reports suggesting that even when the criminal law is actually invoked, the proceedings are really worse than a sham, with judgments and sentences being written out beforehand with blank spaces for the defendant's name. And if we look at these numbers, those reports become very plausible. So not only are the detentions in the re-education camps unlawful under China's domestic law, but the procedures for imprisonment under criminal law also do not pass muster under China's criminal law. So why does any of this matter? Well, first, it's an important element of any argument against China's Xinjiang policies because it allows us to put aside all the disputed questions about, is terrorism a threat? Have specific people engaged in it? Are they legitimately suspected of it? All this. And we can say that even if all that is true, proper legal procedures have to be followed. Terrorism is not an excuse for despotic state lawlessness. A second, the Xinjiang of today is the China of tomorrow. If the state can mobilize these tactics against Uyghurs in Xinjiang today, it can mobilize them against non-Uyghurs in the rest of China tomorrow. What does it say about hopes for reform in China? Well, we cannot hope for a solution through getting China to amend its own laws, since those laws are already going unobserved by the state. And then the final 2 points, it's important for legal authorities outside of China, both international authorities and within various countries, to understand that Chinese law does not constrain the Chinese government. For example, China and other authoritarian governments routinely use Interpol procedures, specifically the issuance of a so-called red notice to try to get at political opponents. And Interpol operates on the assumption that member countries all have basically similar systems and that national police forces will use its procedures in good faith. This is clearly not the case in China, and that case needs to be made forcefully. Or take extradition. The New Zealand Supreme Court, for example, is grappling with a Chinese extradition case right now. Like red notices, extradition proceedings rely on a certain conception of how the legal system of the country requesting the extradition operates. Typically, courts are going to tend to rely on the written law and will assume that it reflects reality. They're not going to be receptive to the idea that a government might completely and without any consequences ignore its own domestic law. So that's why it's important not to normalize or accept this illegality simply because it's what people like us who are professionally familiar with the system have come to expect. Thank you. That's it.
Donald, so thank you so much for your presentation, as well as the audience being mesmerized by that. I know that a number of us legislators will be keen to delve even further, because a lot of the pushback that we get as parliamentarians is that we should not be meddling in Chinese law and justice, but this is now showing that obviously it's not in place. You say that you put together your research over 3 years and no one's contradicted it yet, but that may happen this afternoon. So we'll see what happens if anyone comes forward. We may have some technical difficulties, but I hope not. We're staying within the United States, and we're now going to TENG Biao, who's going to present the concentration camps and genocide in a Chinese political and legal context. Over to you, sir.
Thank you for inviting me to this important conference. I'll talk about the concentration camps and the Uyghur genocide in domestic Chinese political and legal system. And the concentration camps was not from a vacuum. I'll talk about the various forms of extrajudicial detentions and the religious persecutions, the thought reform and brainwashing, and the cultural genocide in Tibet, the CCP's sense of insecurity and its unprecedented high-tech totalitarianism, the manipulation of Han chauvinism and nationalism. There are many forms of extrajudicial detentions and extra-legal detentions in People's Republic of China. Some have been abolished. For example, the investigation detention, the custody and repatriation system, which was targeting the migrant workers. The double designation system was part of the Communist Party's discipline and inspection work. And the internationally infamous Laojiao, re-education through labor system, which was abolished in 2013. Torture is including the Falun Gong practitioners and political dissidents, human rights activists, and many others were severely tortured in the labor camp. Retention for in-camp employment was part of the Laogai system. And detention for education targeted the sex workers and the sex workers' clients, and detention for re-education targeted the people under 16-year-old. There are many extrajudicial detentions still in use. The first one is RSDL, residential surveillance at a designated location. It's part of the China's, it is in China's criminal procedure law, but it's still extrajudicial detention. And compulsory drug treatment, compulsory mental hospital. Some political dissidents and activists like Wang Wanxing, Dong Yaoqiong have been detained in those government-operated mental hospitals. And this kind of black jail targets the petitioners. Hundreds of thousands of petitioners were detained in those black jails normally in big cities. A legal education center is the name of actual legal detention facilities detaining Falun Gong practitioners and other people, mostly Falun Gong. And they were severely tortured, and they were forced to work and forced to convert. This 强制转化, we can see the similar enforced conversion in Xinjiang's concentration camps. And between 1999 and 2021, there have been more than 4,600 Falun Gong practitioners being tortured to death. And concentration camps in Xinjiang is also one form of actual legal detentions in China. From all these kind of actual judicial and actual legal detention facilities, we can see the Communist Party's obsession with education or re-education. Their names are like re-education through labor, reform through labor, detention for education, detention for re-education, and legal education center, the study sessions, and the vocational education and training centers, which is the official name of Xinjiang's concentration camp. And there's a long tradition of thought reform in the CCP history. The difference between the concentration camps in Xinjiang and other actual legal detentions include the concentration camp in Xinjiang targets the certain ethnic minorities, a certain religion and culture, with the purpose of eliminating the whole people's ethnic, culture, and religious identity. It's a part of the genocide, and the sexual assault existed in those camps, and birth control, forced abortion, and forced sterilization made this camp more special. The cultural genocide in Tibet, we all know that Chen Quanguo used to be the head of Tibet between 2011 and 2016, before he became the party secretary of Xinjiang. And he duplicated and intensified his playbook in Tibet, including the mass arrest and the torture, the religious persecution and linguistic suppression, and many different forms of travel restrictions, and a great system of surveillance. According to the Australia media, China also set up military-style concentration camps in Tibet. And religious persecution, the Chinese authorities persecute all kinds of religions, but some religions are persecuted more severely than others, like the Tibetan Buddhism, the Uyghur Islam, and Falun Gong are the most persecuted religion. And to a little bit lesser extent, the underground Christian and Catholic churches. After Xi Jinping came to power, he has started a comprehensive crackdown. Almost all the forces in Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao era has been suppressed, including the human rights activists, lawyers, dissidents, non-governmental organizations, the evil cult, and the underground churches, internet, media, universities. And Xi Jinping started anti-corruption campaign and clearing out the underworld campaign. And also the celebrities, entrepreneurs, and private companies were persecuted, and Tibetans, Hong Kong, and Inner Mongolia and Xinjiang, of course. The CCP has an exaggerated sense of insecurity. After 1989, there have been some new social energies promoting human rights and rule of law in China. Even though those kind of fundamental political system did not change, but the development of internet, the market economy, and the spread of liberal ideas and the rights defense movement contributed a bigger civil society roughly in Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao era. But the CCP also is facing comprehensive crisis like economic, political, and social crisis, and also the ideological crisis. The high technology totalitarianism has been looming in China. The Communist Party uses the big data, the Great Firewall, and Golden Shield, and artificial intelligence like facial recognition, voice print recognition, and also DNA social credit system, the social media, and surveillance cameras to tighten its control on the society. This high-tech totalitarian system is working effectively among these methods established after 1949. For example, the use of secret police and the networked stability maintenance and black jails and brainwashing and mass arrest and culture of personality. Previously around Mao Zedong, now around Xi Jinping. There are some pictures about facial recognition, surveillance cameras, and the gait recognition and DNA. The party also used virtual reality to test party members' loyalty. And during the COVID-19, the health code system is also utilized by the authorities to tighten its control. And the Chinese authorities manipulated the Han chauvinism and nationalism. There's a long tradition of Da Yitong, great unification in Chinese history. And the CCP use this kind of anti-separatism narrative. The brutal method in Xinjiang even gained support from many Han Chinese people. And the concept of 中华民族, the Chinese nation, was a strong idea, and the CCP increasingly manipulates this concept, and also Xi Jinping's the Chinese dream, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, and also the social Darwinism, racism, and the anti-Muslim narrative is also used by the Communist Party, irritates the hatred against Uyghurs and other Muslims. So there have been many policies discriminating against ethnic minorities in China. So the Han chauvinism is also contributing to the current persecution of the Uyghurs. I think I have explained a bit the domestic, political, and legal context of the Uyghur genocide and the concentration camps. And I will stop here. Look forward to comments and the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Teng Bao. When you're having international conferences, you are going to come up with some technical difficulties. But I am correct in saying that all of the slides will be available linked to the conference, so people can access those slides going forward. Thank you so much. We now have quite a unique presentation. Professor Joe Smith-Finlay is actually going to present on behalf of an individual who wishes to remain anonymous because they're anxious about their security. Professor Joe, I'm going to hand over to you, but I believe the presentation is entitled "The Shouts of a Handful of the Younger Generation, Discordant Notes in the CCP's Grand Narrative." So Professor Joe, over to you.
It's an honor to speak. It's an honor to speak on behalf of all of the members of my YouTube channel team at such an important conference. Most of us are current students or students who have just graduated. Although our voice may not represent the attitude of all members of the younger generation in China, we hope to shout out loudly some thoughts that are diametrically opposed to mainstream views. All of us are from China, and we express our concern and our heartache for the ongoing genocide, persecution, and severe humanitarian disaster in Xinjiang, East Turkestan. Some people in our team have studied and lived in Western countries for more than 10 years. Some of us are still in China, and some of us are Han Chinese who grew up in Xinjiang. Regardless of our different experiences, we all refuse to accept the CCP's grand narrative and political propaganda. And we all hope to find the truth in our own way and to spread that truth widely. And this was our original motivation in establishing our YouTube channel. The YouTube channel is called "There's Nothing Happening in Xinjiang." Our experience of recognizing that the CCP's propaganda does not match the facts differs from person to person. For example, after entering the world of freedom of information, some of us were willing to step out of the comfort zone of our native language and not read reports related to Xinjiang with some kind of preconception. Then the shocking narrative exposed by the non-PRC media naturally pushed them to dig deeper into the truth and led to some serious thinking. For another person on our team, because they also believe in Allah, they paid special attention to the religious persecution in Xinjiang, and they instinctively rejected the CCP's slander and propaganda. Yet another person on our team grew up in a family with a broader ideological horizon, so they had more opportunities to get in touch with different truths or perspectives from a very early age. Another one of us grew up in Xinjiang, and their personal experience of daily life in that region reminded them over and over again that the CCP's narrative is by no means the truth. For another person, the route to enlightenment was even simpler. They found that the CCP members they knew did not match their words with deeds, and so they began to question. All of these diverse experiences have given birth to a common result: thinking and acting. We try to understand what actually happened, based on common sense and reason. To quote from an article written by one of our team, in 2018, when nobody was talking about the Xinjiang concentration camps, I heard the rumors, and I decided to take a look for myself. I was shocked to realize that they were real. I talked with multiple Han Chinese taxi drivers to verify the situation. They all expressed their concern and their anger towards the Chinese Communist government. Unfortunately, they were too scared to speak out in public. The CCP has a long history of acting ruthlessly towards anyone who disobeys its will, regardless of their ethnicity and regardless of their relationship to the party. They used to glorify the children who persecuted their own parents during the Cultural Revolution, an era which our current party leader, Xi Jinping, praises. Furthermore, the Chinese Communist Party justifies the concentration camps in Xinjiang by claiming that the Uyghurs interned there are criminals. Comparing that to what I learned in a political science class in the US about racism, I can clearly see the racism that underpins the CCP propaganda. Yes, some Uyghur criminals are murderers and rapists who deserve punishment, just as with every other ethnicity. But punishing the criminals does not need to extend to punishing their family, their co-workers, their friends, and Billy, who sits next to them in a church service. By combining racism and socialist authoritarianism, you will end up with National Socialism, aka Nazism. Recognizing the severity of this situation, I completely changed my attitude towards the Chinese Communist regime." Unquote. But this process of beginning to question the CCP narrative is not always so smooth. Another person on our team wrote, and again I quote, "I have many different opinions on the CCP, and naturally I am immune to their continued propaganda. But sometimes, if I read too much of their propaganda, I begin to feel as if all is at peace in our country. And I wonder whether I was wrong about the CCP. But then, one by one, major events happening in China are confirming my previous suspicions. The CCP really likes to engage in false, great, and empty propaganda, 假大空, treating funerals as happy events and treating mistakes as achievements. This situation makes me feel very torn, or it makes me unsure that I completely understand the full picture of the CCP and of China." Unquote. Similar conflicts and tearing feelings about the changes in what we know and think are reflected in the process of our making videos on our YouTube channel as well. Sometimes our brains will be occupied by anger and irrationality, inadvertently deviating from the trajectory of the facts, and beginning to selectively narrate, to portray the CCP simply as an extremely evil and brutal regime and colonizer. But it's obvious that such an emotional and unnuanced narrative is not conducive to the spread of truth. We must clarify the causes and the consequences and discuss the CCP's rule in Xinjiang in an objective and a logical manner, rather than a simple black and white judgment based on the CCP's own model. Sometimes, in the process of choosing words and constructing sentences, we still look at issues and conflicts from the Han perspective, and we use inappropriate words such as liberate Xinjiang or recapture Xinjiang. This shows that the CCP's long-term brainwashing propaganda has had a lasting and far-reaching impact on our consciousness and also on our subconscious selves. It is like a kind of inertial thinking that will bring us under the influence of the grand historical narrative of the CCP, where we lack any control. But fortunately, we have noticed this, and we try to consciously exclude this influence. The more that we are able to exclude it, the greater the possibility of us reaching the truth. In short, the process of making videos benefited us a lot, and our finished products will be presented to the public in the near future. Finally, we want to say something about the Chinese Communist authorities and the future of East Turkestan. We do not want to see the hatred between different ethnicities deepen or conflicts intensify. We firmly believe that human rights are above sovereignty. Therefore, no matter whether the future of China and East Turkestan is to maintain the status quo or to divide into two countries, we all hope that it can be based on the wishes of all ethnic groups rather than on political interests. At the same time, we are not optimistic. We are at the end of the road. It is indeed difficult to eliminate the contradictions among ethnic groups. It seems difficult for East Turkestan to either maintain the status quo or to become independent. The population structure there has completely changed. For some Han people, this is their new home. For other ethnic groups, this is their lost homeland. Based on these realities, we have no idea about the future. However, it's at least certain that so long as the CCP still exists for another day, the situation in East Turkestan will only get worse and cannot get better. We are worried that Uyghurs and Kazakhs will become the Jews of the 21st century. Taiwan will become the Czechoslovakia of the 21st century. And the leaders of certain countries, in appeasing China, will become the Neville Chamberlain or the Edouard Daladier of the 21st century. As the CCP creates one trouble after another in Tibet, Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, it faces more and more risks and losses. Yet what we are seeing is a CCP firmly realizing its will to rule, step by step. And so far, it has not failed. Just when the CCP will cross its Rhineland is not yet known. But we firmly believe that it will cross over in the not too distant future. What we feel is that nationalism in China is rising, and common sense and rationality are rapidly being lost. Please stop this totalitarian machine, not only to end the persecution and genocide of ethnic groups in Xinjiang, but also to safeguard all of our futures.
Professor Joe was reading on behalf of anonymous young people in China who put that statement together, and I felt it was incredibly moving and knowledgeable and food for thought there. Thank you so much, Professor Joe, for speaking out those words. We don't have a huge amount of time, but we would like to take some questions. If anyone has any questions, can they please raise their hands or let me know so we can pose some questions to our panelists. Please don't be shy. We do have, yes, what would your question be? And to whom? I think the microphone's coming round.
Thanks a lot. Well, first of all, thank you very much for that last statement. I think it was really touching, and there's a lot of points to be considered by all of us. My question is mainly to Donald Clarke, though I think maybe some of the other panelists could also answer it, especially maybe Teng Biao. Is there any kind of legal framework growing out of the global war on terror in China on terrorist threats or anything like that that is being used as an excuse to incarcerate people? And if so, how does that compare to other countries' legal framework on terrorism and similar incarcerations, without saying that that is the same thing in any way? The only thing that, or things that come into my mind is Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo and places like that, that also have some kind of legal framework. How are these legal frameworks comparable, or does something like that even exist in China? Thank you.
Can we get Donald on the screen? Donald, before you respond, can I just add a point there? My anxiety is that the CCP don't need any sort of set of rules to try and incarcerate people who they claim are terrorists, if they're incarcerating men for having beards and women for wearing headscarves. So I'm very anxious about trying to put those 2 points together, because it just enables the CCP to do what they're continuing to do without any justification. But Donald, over to you for a far more deeper perspective.
So great question. So again, I want to separate two kinds of detention. The first is, detention in the re-education camps, and that is, not done under any, at least publicly available legal framework that anybody knows about. So, again, no publicly available, set of standards that says what are the offenses and what is the procedure. So there's just nothing there. Growing a beard apparently counts. Telling people not to watch porn apparently counts. So there's just nothing there. And if you were to compare it with legal framework in other countries, the comparison would be that other countries have a legal framework and China has zero legal framework for detention in the re-education camps. Now let's talk about detention under the kind of pretext of a substantive violation of the criminal law and the procedures allegedly of the criminal procedure law. So China has a law about terrorism, has a law on national security, but the important thing to understand is that criminal law in China exists only in this document called the Criminal Law of the People's Republic of China. And if the offense is not there, it's not a criminal offense. So other laws tend to say that, if X constitutes a crime, then, punish criminally, which is, of course, just a tautology. But you have to go back to the criminal law to find the action. In other words, this capital C, capital L, this particular statute, you have to go there to find the substantive offense. And then when we look in the criminal law, it says, it has the word terrorism. It also has words like extremism, but it does not define them. Okay, so the definition, it doesn't define them with any degree of precision. So the definition of what counts as terrorism or extremism is not really in any important way set forth in the criminal law. It's just an open-ended invitation, to lock people up for anything. So again, the Chinese authorities can now say, well, we're following the criminal law because this person is an extremist, and extremism, is criminalized under the criminal law. But again, what counts as extremism? Well, it's telling people not to watch porn or having a beard. So if we were to compare that with the legal framework in other countries, sorry, I'm getting some feedback here. Can somebody turn off their microphone? Thanks. So if we were to compare that with the legal framework in other countries, the difference would be that the offenses, as far as I know, in, for example, let's say liberal democracies, are much more specifically defined. So, in other words, shooting someone or blowing someone up, whether or not you do it for terrorist purposes, is already a crime, and you don't need to, add terrorism into it. And very often, the crimes that are committed by people that we label as terrorists, are simply crimes, and they don't need to be separately prosecuted as terrorist offenses. If we were to say, well, what's the comparison with what's going on at, people being imprisoned in Guantanamo? Of course, the people, as I understand it, the detainees in Guantanamo are not being detained as terrorists as such. I believe that is people who have been detained for basically from engaging in combat in Afghanistan, and that I might be wrong about that. So obviously there are some issues there. We do know one difference, of course, is that the charges are public. One can see what they are charged with. They have access to legal counsel. We know who they are, and I guess whatever the problems of transparency might be, they don't seem to be anywhere near the scale of the problems of transparency that we have in the Chinese system. So I think really the issue is not maybe, one can talk about the substance and have disagreements about the substance, but I think the difference in the process is quite important. That there is a degree of transparency if we look at the kind of anti-terrorist criminal law framework of other countries that we just don't see at all in China.
Thank you so much, Donald. I'm not sure whether Tang Biao can actually hear us and if he wishes to contribute very briefly.
Besides the criminal law, the National Congress passed the anti-terrorism law in 2015. But again, China is not a country with rule of law, and so in the anti-terrorist field, the authorities don't follow the rules, and they exercise their power quite arbitrarily, as we see in Xinjiang.
Thank you.
But again, let me emphasize, the anti-terrorist law by itself does not criminalize terrorism. It sets up, what it purports to do is to set up some mechanisms for, combating terrorism. But to find someone criminally guilty of terrorism, you've got to find the offense in the criminal law. If it's not in the criminal law, it's not a criminal offense. However, criminal law just says the word, terrorism, it says the word extremism, and then almost anything can be lumped in under those very broad terms.
Thank you, Donald. It was great to see our other speaker on the screen, but we're now going to go very quickly to Eva. I believe you wish to contribute briefly as well.
Said about the lack of legal basis, I would perhaps only make 2 points. One is that I think that especially where the government is emphasizing, as it has done in the context of these so-called training camps, that they are based on voluntary internment, on voluntary participation. I think that any potentially available justification for coercive incarceration is actually ruled out by the authorities themselves, who insist that that the camps are based on voluntary on voluntariness. The second point, however, that I would like to make is that I think that although I agree that rule of law guarantees and transparency is much greater in liberal democracies in principle, I do think that the Chinese authorities have benefited enormously from the war on terror discourse, and also the anti-extremism discourse, and the tendency to expand the notion of terrorism and extremism in terms of their own practices at a rhetorical level, at the level of obfuscation and seeking to justify what they are doing. And of course, some of these practices, within liberal democracies are themselves problematic and have given rise to the criticism that liberal democracies are engaging in some authoritarian practices. Not to equate these, but I do think that there's a justificatory strategy that links to anti-terrorism and anti-extremism discourse in liberal democracies.
Yeah, on that note, can I add, I highly recommend Sean Roberts' book, China's War on the Uyghurs, because he talks about this background and the role that the United States, among others, took a extremely, somewhat shameful role in defining terrorism to include everything we don't like, and in specifically labeling the East Turkestan Islamic movement, a terrorist organization responsible for hundreds of deaths when there was absolutely no evidence for it. This is back in 2002, so that they could get China on board for the Iraq invasion. So it's not an honorable history there.
I believe there is one final question from the floor. Is there any final questions from the floor? Maybe there are no final questions from the floor. Thank you. My only, if I may, as chairing this, my anxiety is that we're trying to rationalize the irrational. And when young people in their hundreds of thousands are incarcerated in re-education camps, we must remember that they are seen as being born guilty just by being born Uyghur. And we must always remember the starting point before we go down a rabbit hole of what is and isn't terrorism from the CCP's perspective. But I want to say a massive thank you to our fantastic panel. I know it's been incredibly complicated as it was an international panel, but thank you so much. Nobody challenged Donald's 3 years of research, so he can sit very safely on his conclusions today. And thank you so much as well, Professor Joe, for reading out on behalf of our anonymous guest. Thank you so much.